Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I am your host, Marianne Petrie. I have a brand new guest. I'm proud to have Dr. Bandy Lee on. She's a medical doctor, a forensic psychiatrist, and a world expert on violence who taught at Yale School of Medicine and Yale Law School for 17 years before transferring recently to Columbia and Harvard. She became known to the public by leading a group of mental health professional colleagues in breaking the silence about the immediate past U.S. president's dangerous psychology and publishing the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 37 Psychiatrists and Mental Health Experts Assess a President, Macmillan, 2017 and 2019. The volume proceeded from an ethics conference she organized at Yale School of Medicine, which led her consulting with over 50 members of the U.S. Congress. She is currently president of the World Mental Health Coalition, the largest professional organization to address the problem of dangerous leadership and its contribution to a psychological pandemic. I welcome you, Dr. Bandy Lee, and we have a lot to talk about. And how did you get involved in forensic psychiatry?
Yes, I first became a forensic psychiatrist because I was interested in psychiatry. I was interested in healing the human mind, and I felt that that was the greatest source of suffering. But then a lot of uh, psychiatric patients were going into jails and prisons. And as a forensic psychiatrist, I've worked in the prison setting. I've become uh, very aware and acutely um, uh, become knowledgeable about the abuses that have gone on in society through the use of the correctional structure. And as a forensic psychiatrist, I have specialized in violence and working with violent offenders, as well as testifying in different courts, um, and working with governments as well.
Now, look, let me ask you this: with the violent offenders and these people being incarcerated, I know this is kind of an off the beaten path question, but do you find that a lot of them come from foster homes, foster care?
Well, whether we recognize it in their history or not, all of them have been mistreated and abused.
Mhm.
Violence has been done to them such that they have become individuals who also perpetrate violence. So,
Mhm.
yes, a lot of them do come from foster homes.
Mhm. And when they're incarcerated, they don't do much with rehabilitation for these people, much at all.
Well, that's what we've actually helped to change in the
Mhm.
last 25 years.
Mhm.
Um, Especially my getting involved in the Resolve to Stop the Violence project in San Francisco. It started there at the same time as the entire country was going toward solitary confinement and more punitive measures. San Francisco actually had a very innovative project that put together violent offenders into one open dormitory and involved them in intense rehabilitation and programming. And it was so successful, more than 83, 84% of them would go on not to commit violence, no violent recidivism. And because of the success of the program, it's been replicated in a dozen different countries, got spread all around the world before starting to be implemented in this country after 20 years of failure in the other system.
Mhm. There's also, I don't know if you have had to deal with juveniles and them going into, you know, juvenile prison settings.
Yes, I have dealt with juveniles. I've worked in juvenile justice centers as well as um, helped to reduce solitary confinement for them because young adults even don't fully have developed brains. Uh, if we went purely by the neurobiology, they would mature more at around 25 to 30. So, so we help to reduce solitary confinement for young adults and juveniles up to age 25.
Mm-hmm. And when they talk to you, are they making good eye contact? Are they receptive to you?
Well, juveniles, because they don't have fully developed brains, they're also less socialized
Mhm.
than adults are, and so they need a lot of contact. They need um, a lot of social contact, a lot of nurturance in that way. And when they haven't received what they so vitally need, they also develop ways of rejecting it. And that's why they act up. And it's actually a cry for help in a way,
Mhm.
truly an expression of need. But we as a society, instead of providing them with what they need, have given them the opposite. We've put them in isolation. We didn't wish to deal with them, so we've incarcerated them. We've treated them badly, and so they are the ones who turn out to become the violent offenders when they
Mhm.
come out, when they grow into adulthood.
And then you'd have the revolving door of incarceration.
That's correct. We are actually creating a society of abuse perpetuating more abuse. And um, as things become systemic, things were very systemic as we had embarked on a culture of mass incarceration where our incarceration rates had gone far above
Mhm.
any of the other countries. We essentially held half the world prisoners in uh, while just having 2% of the world's population. Um, yes, please go ahead.
Oh, no, I didn't I was just listening. I'm sure you've interviewed people that were wrongly accused, and,
Yes, yes.
what do you do with cases like that?
Well, in this country, sentencing and incarceration depends more on race and gender than on any other factor, including crime. And so we're essentially incarcerating uh, poor young Black men and and punishing them for their poverty and their race, things that they cannot control. Um, extreme those who commit extremely detrimental crimes, such as uh, structural, um, cultural, societal crimes, which are uh, done more at a systemic level, more at the level of corporations, institutions, or even government. Those individuals are rarely um,
Mm.
uh, sentenced or imprisoned, and those kinds of crimes are extremely harmful. Not don't just result in one or a handful of deaths at a time, but hundreds, thousands, and even over a million, as I have pointed out with uh, the last president that we've had.
Mm. Do you find that, have you ever had to interview any of the individuals that have, taken part in school shootings?
Um, Not school shootings so much, but yes, mass shootings, um, mass murder, serial murders. I have worked mostly in maximum security prisons. And so, yes, I've worked with those individuals.
With the serial murderers, I used to be a psychiatric nurse, and, I found criminals very fascinating. I'm sure you must also. What do you find very fascinating about these serial murderers?
Well, what is most striking to me is that we could have intervened at any point in time before things get to that state, but we as a society do not. In fact, we seem to be doing everything possible to make the problem as bad as possible, at least in this country, because we, as you were noting, instead of focusing on rehabilitation and programming, we focus on punitive measures, punishing those who are actually victims of societal structures. And related to that, I have come to learn of the family court system
Mm-hmm.
in this country, which was quite a shocking revelation to me. I had been working with prisons for 2.5 decades now, and it was um, quite evident that high levels of unspeakable kinds of violence was occurring in these societal structures because of the concrete walls that separated what was happening from the public's view. And everything was happening without any transparency, without public accountability, and without prosecution. I've seen prison guards provoke prisoners or set up prisoners into gladiator fights, to beat up just chain prisoners who have not done anything, just for the sport of it, to beat them. And I am quite sure that I've seen cases that caused the death of the prisoner.
Mm-hmm.
And rarely do those cases ever get prosecuted or punished.
Mm-hmm.
And these are routine occurrences. I worked for quite some time at Rikers Island Correctional Facility in New York City, which led to my 2013 report on the facility that brought in the federal investigators, that helped bring in the federal investigators. And they found a severe, intractable subculture of violence there that would never be allowed in the rest of society if the society ever knew about it. But because it was happening behind closed doors, it was allowed to go on. And I'm finding that now, much to my horror, that the same thing is happening with the family courts. Now, I've worked with criminal courts and other civil courts throughout my career of now almost a quarter century. And I never imagined that there would be a court of law where violence is the norm, where perpetrators are encouraged and helped and colluded with, bringing the entire force of the law against innocent individuals, the most innocent and helpless individuals in society, which are the children and the caregivers who love them. Mm-hmm. And it's actually a revelation that has shocked me to my core, and that's saying a lot, since I've seen a lot in my career, including all kinds of street gangs and the kinds of violence that individuals do to one another. And I myself grew up in the Bronx when it was very violent there. I grew up at a time when there were already bullet holes in school windows and gangs were recruiting, and there was a memorial of kids my age, I was a teenager at the time, who had died every other block. So that was the inner city. Mm-hmm. But we're not talking about the judicial system and the fact that so many children are dying as a result of more than 100 children even by the most conservative uh, research measures, are found to be dying as a result of family court intervention, of essentially transferring children to their abusive parent, usually an abusive father. And we know that child abuse is very common in this country.
Mhm.
1 in 5 children are abused, and that also is a low estimate. And for family courts not to take abuse into consideration, but rather take allegations of abuse as a signal, perhaps, to a signal for an opportunity to do the wrong thing and to profit from doing the wrong thing, is a staggering reality that I'm just horrified to recognize. And the reason I've come to learn of this is through a personal situation when my sister thought she was undergoing a normal divorce until suddenly her abusive husband was allowed to kidnap the children, abduct them, place her essentially out of reach of them for 15 months at this point. It's still ongoing. And it placed not only her, but all those who care about the children, and including the babysitter, everyone in a crisis. But the father is able to get away with it with the entire court structure behind it.
The judicial system, what I've been noticing is they're not looking at any exhibits or evidence of abuse. They're not, they're not listening to the targeted fit parent, and there's no accountability, and they are handing over these children to abusers, and it's like, this is an epidemic.
It's
Als
an international crisis.
Yes. Oh, globally, and the child psychological abuse that these judges are perpetuating in these courtrooms, it must be stopped.
Yes, just last month, the United Nations had, well, it closed its call now, but it put out a call for families from all over the world to submit their experiences of the family courts, because it started in this country, but it's now so widespread that it's become an international epidemic and pandemic. And the way it started in this country is a psychiatrist by the name of Richard Gardner. I believe
Mhm.
there's considerable evidence that he was an abuser of his children himself, abuser of children himself, sexual abuser. He had the idea that abuse was not bad, but those who are usually mothers who are objecting to the sexual abuse, the incest, are alienating the other parent, and they were suffering from parental alienation syndrome.
Mhm.
And even though that was never accepted in the scholarly literature, he had to self-publish his books, his articles, everything, because no respectable scientific publication would accept him. And the parental alienation syndrome is not accepted by any psychological body. In fact, some psychological bodies are now coming out to say that this is not a valid syndrome, and in fact, that it should be stricken from our vocabulary because it's been so abused. But what happened was that it became an incredibly powerful weapon in the court system because of our adversarial legal structure. And when there's a divorce, whatever you can weaponize, you use against the other person. And even when there are situations of life-threatening abuse and domestic violence, in the family court system, it's considered, too former husband and wife usually fighting each other, and it's not seen in the context of violent offenses and possible death. And the fact that most murders of women and children happen in the home means that if usually the man, but also increasingly women also, but it's mostly the men. And in the family court system, it's still it's a highly patriarchal system that favors men, and so I'm going to state the perpetrators as men. Usually, when the man brings up the allegation of parental alienation, then they're able to seize custody, and usually the woman is labeled as mentally ill for making these false allegations, and they're often they're hospitalized, imprisoned, kept from seeing their children. And given how common domestic violence is and how child abuse is truly a crisis of pandemic levels, it's essentially a carte blanche for the criminal child abuser to get away with their abuse. And so that's why they congregate so in such a concentrated way in family courts, and women who can't escape the court's jurisdiction are often destroyed, actually, and the children are taken from them.
Right. In fact, that happened to me with the opposing attorney calling out that I was mentally ill and I was alienating the children. And from that get-go, and that was the first words that were said, that totally rigged the whole process. And
That's right.
the thing is, what they're doing is they shouldn't be using the term parental alienation, because the courts are using it to soothe a bruised male's ego and get the kids away from the other parent. And
Yes.
oh, go ahead.
In the beginning, I think it was through a misunderstanding, because the psychology is so complex. Courts had judges were not trained in either domestic violence or psychological abuse, and so I think it was in the beginning fairly honest, even though it was pretty detrimental. Now I believe that it's a whole entire system that is profiting from the structure of domestic violence and psychological victimization. And even if there weren't this kind of complication, just pointing out the degree of violence that an offender is committing against his family will, unless you are aware that such phenomena happen, that such violence happens within closed doors, and more often within closed doors than against strangers, or domestic violence accounts for a far greater proportion than any other kind of violence, including war. So to discount this possibility has allowed for family courts to become a place where abusers congregate. But now I believe that the courts are colluding with the offenders. And in fact, it's become a lucrative business. And what's happening is essentially child trafficking to violent offenders away from their homes and loving families, their loving parents, to their abusers, tormentors, and murderers. And the fact that the legal structure is involved in this kind of organized crime really is a very disturbing fact.
Do you find that there are more personality disorders, even viewing the family court? I'm finding there's more personality disorders, and I think they're perpetuated by the family court system so they can keep having cases come up as these kids who have been dragged through the family court, um, their lives aren't the same, and then they perpetuate what was done to them onto someone else. Then we've got generations of dysfunction now going through the family court system, and it's a moneymaker.
Yes. So Dr. Richard Gardner was popular in the early 1980s. So this has been going on for 40 years now. So we have generation after generation of children being sent to their abusers, their psychological lives being destroyed. They're becoming the next generation of offenders. And not to say that all victimized individuals become offenders,
Right.
about half of them do.
Mm.
Um, but once they do, we need to stop them. But rather than stopping them, if family courts are run by these abusive individuals with an abuser's psychology, then they will certainly create a system and a culture where more offenders will be created. And this is essentially the structure we have. The fact that so many families do go through the family courts, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of individuals per year.
Mhm. And it's very sad when, these judges can't recognize a personality disorder, or maybe they don't care. Some people think judges need more training. You would think they would be intelligent enough and to have been around the block enough to see and know when someone's lying to them. I don't know.
Well, not even the best prosecutors and criminal court judges I have found are attuned enough to the criminal psychology to be able to detect it all the time. In fact, the worst offenders, the most psychopathic individuals, psychopathy is a type of psychiatric defect when one lacks empathy and conscience, and so are capable of all manner of heinous crimes, the most heinous crimes, but they're also the most manipulative. It's a condition that's called the mask of sanity, because it looks so, I mean, not only does a person look well, they can look superbly humane, empathic and compassionate, but it's all a mask in order to cover up their predatory intent.
Mhm,
And so, so the worst offenders actually get away from
mhm,
the criminal justice system. And we know of many stories where serial murderers may not be caught for decades.
mhm,
And why do people enter the car with them? It's
mhm,
uh, they're very good at beguiling other people.
mhm,
So so it takes an expert to be able to detect them, and even experts have to do considerable examination. So the key is, first of all, not to have judges who would, even despite that fact, even despite the lack of training, would, or even if we did have enough training, there are certain personalities who would be automatically attracted to individuals with this kind of psychopathy
mhm,
and wish to help them and collude with them and co-conspire in ways that they could both profit. And we've tried for a while to give judges the respect and trust um, and authority to be able to carry out the function we charge them with. But we have learned that that kind of privilege does not always work. In fact, the lack of accountability of judges having absolute immunity, and there being no legal repercussions of even the greatest crimes, including murder of countless children, makes it a very attractive place for criminals to congregate, for criminal
Yes.
psychology to gather and desire that kind of what is really tyrannical power. And so, unfortunately, a lot of lawyers and I believe a lot of judges do have a criminal psychology, just like many politicians have come to have it, because there has been no way to hold politicians accountable. They make the rules and the laws. And so there actually have been studies that show that psychopathic individuals, those without a conscience and those who are out to harm people, they actually don't bring much benefit, by the way. They may think that they're bringing a lot of benefit, but that's what they believe. That what they actually bring is a lot of destruction, and they disguise it as if it were help, as if it were productivity. I think the positions that have the greatest number of such individuals is CEO positions, chief executive officers of corporations, and then secondly is the legal profession, and then thirdly was the medical profession.
Mhm.
I think that should be quickly going down, because the medical profession is quickly losing its status and position it had before in society, mainly because corporations have taken over the hospitals and made them, hospitals and clinics have become so ineffective because of business having taken over. But to return to the main issue, what I believe is happening now, and the reason why the problem of family courts is so intractable, is because of lack of transparency. The psychopathic personalities who are attracted to the judges' positions, and lack of accountability. There is no way to hold a judge accountable when you are using the judicial structure, because they are the ones who are making the rules within that system. So because of this, I'm editing a book, tentatively called The Dangerous Case of the Family Courts. But I believe that the family courts need to be exposed and illustrated. First of all, the lack of transparency needs to be dealt with. The main way by which family courts have gotten away with this at this level of spread, nationally and internationally. Nationally, it's every state. Internationally, it's spreading, but mostly starting with the countries most influenced by U.S. Policies. So starting with Canada, the UK, and then Europe, South America, all these regions are now being affected, seeing this as a lucrative means of, as a lucrative business. In fact, child trafficking is a lucrative business. Again, we need not see it as simply an across-the-border group thing. It's become far more lucrative than illicit drugs now. It's now also happening when you have the entire judicial structure supporting you, and you're immune from prosecution, and it's so profitable, either because the grateful parent, the abusive parent, is paying under the table money, or whether they are making donations through fathers' rights groups, I heard, are being used in this way. They initially formed through good intentions of allowing caring fathers to have a role in their children's lives, but now it's turned into supporting abusive parents, abusive fathers, and funneling money, essentially laundering money to the judges. And even if the father does not have the financial means, if the father is abusive and you let them off the hook, essentially allow them not to be prosecuted through the power you have through the family courts, then there can be an agreement that the father will traffic the child, literally, to gangs and groups that send the children around to powerful pedophilic individuals. And so we know from the Catholic Church and now the Southern Baptists and through multiple organizations that this is a widespread problem, and the demand is high because once, as it goes with physical violence, it happens also with sexual violence. Once you're sexually violated, you're likely to sexually violate again. And so it's becoming a more and more widespread problem.
And the no accountability, the no immunity, it just because I know you and I have talked on the phone about this, and I had told you a little bit about my story, but it's just very frustrating to get any type of justice when a judge who is, say, a sociopath in nature identifies with the opposing attorney who has the same characteristics, who also donated, like I had told you, to his judge campaign. You know, that's what they're all doing. Money is being exchanged, and it's a matter, if you need to win your case, you have to find the right attorney who is, we'll say, friends with the judge. I mean, that could go both ways. It could go badly. It could go really great. It does for a lot of people. But what do you think of that, the identification of the sociopathy between the judge and attorneys?
Well, actually, I'm a large part of my book will be about family courts from an offender's point of view, because I work mostly with perpetrators. It's easy for me to identify that, in fact, these courts are operating. They're certainly not operating by the rule of law. They're operating through the perpetration of psychological violence. The way that they are doing it is by breaking the good parent, the loving parent, psychologically, by taking away their children, by incarcerating them. Now, these are, the more loving they are, the less likely they would have been familiar with this world, and the more caught off they are. And usually they have been abused by their spouse, who has, by their partner, who has already broken their spirit in many ways. Now, the way that this happens, it's also called battered woman syndrome. It could be a battered husband syndrome, of course, but the reason why it started with a battered woman syndrome is because it's usually the woman, and the woman who has no recourse in a largely patriarchal structure, where the man has not only all the legal structure and everything to the benefit of his doubt, to his benefit, but also public opinion. The public does not wish to see the man as being the foremost perpetrator violator and murderer of his wife. It's not a picture we'd like to have of a husband or a father, but that is the reality. And when women try to express any of this, nobody confirms it, but rather wishes to deny it. And so the victim is often blamed. So the victim turns out blaming herself. And that is how the victim becomes her worst defender and the best defender of the abuser, her worst advocate and the best defender of the abuser. That's what happens psychologically when one is completely helpless and there's no recourse. So you can imagine it happens in the worst cases of abuse. It's called battered woman syndrome. Now, it happens more generally in that the victimized, abused individual identifies with the abuser in order to make the abuse more palatable. In other words, to survive. So she helps. She ends up helping the abuser and the entire system that is against her, and will not fight, will not litigate against the abuser or the courts, will not bring the court to accountability. And this is what the family courts are making use of. And additionally, they've made it so seamless that you can't fight it, because when they employ all these so-called mental health experts, who are usually not even doctorates, I've seen in my sister's case an LAC, a licensed associate counselor, who said she was mistaken about the whole thing, was held as being more credible to the court than 7 world-renowned psychiatrists and doctorate psychologists who have all attested by now that she's not only mentally sound, but has excellent mental health and all her life, and has exceptional talent in parenting. That's been the unanimous opinion. In fact, there could not be a more clear-cut case in that the mother has an impeccable track record. She was actually a government official who played a large role after September 11. In fact, a nationally central role, and everyone looked up to her. The first responders, the mayor's office, governor's office, the FBI, and yet this individual who decided to become a full-time mom, to be a good mom, is now being labeled as being unfit to be a parent by people who have no expertise, and by this one LAC who is actually not fully licensed.
Yeah, it's very scary. I mean, there are attorneys that are, the guardian ad litem, and yet they also want to moonlight as a psychologist. I've seen that as
Yes,
well.
yes. Well, the guardian ad litem is deciding which psychological report counts and which doesn't. And all
Yes,
the good ones she's suppressing, because that's not profitable for the court.
right.
And so this is an extreme problem, and that there are mental health professionals of inferior training and inferior qualifications who are finding this as an avenue to gain business with the courts. Once they produce a fraudulent report for the court, they be called upon by others to make a very lucrative living, whereas by their credentials alone, they may not even have a job.
Yeah.
And these are the kinds of people the courts are employing. One thing I've noticed is that fully trained psychiatrists, forensic psychiatrists, I've rarely seen them make fraudulent reports for the courts. It's really these poorly trained, those who we would not consider experts in the mental health field, are presenting themselves as experts because they have a supervised counseling position.
Very scary. Could you tell us, do you know when the dangerous case of the family court will be published? Do you know how long that will be?
Well, I'm trying to expedite it as quickly as possible. And in fact, since my announcement, I've been inundated with abstracts, with stories from uh, victimized mothers who have
Mhm,
lost custody of their children. And it's every story you would think would make headlines. The
mhm,
number one front page, New York Times front page paper headlines, and yet all of these go untold because because of gag orders, mainly because family courts, unlike the rest of the judicial system, which is supposed to be transparent, we we've deliberately, the founding fathers have made the judicial system deliberately transparent so that it would be just and clear and fair. Uh, Only the family court system, I found, is able to blanket seal their records and place gag orders on the mothers. Um, and not only do they imprison mothers for breaking this so-called seal, they attribute any talk about the children of the family as breaking the court seal and therefore uh, incarcerable, which
mhm,
is what I find. When I first started reading about family courts, one thing that struck in my mind was how many women were going to jail, how many mothers were actually going to jail.
mhm,
And I thought even one would be so surprising. They're routinely going to jail.
mhm,
And in
mhm,
fact, it appears that maybe a majority, maybe because a greater number than the majority of children who are abused are going to their abusive parents and usually to their sole custody.
mhm,
And what do abusers and violent offenders do? They attribute, they project their own culpability and their own mental illness onto the person they're trying to persecute.
mhm,
Uh, Especially the healthier the woman is, the more they will wish to label them as ill or criminal because they're actually talking about themselves. They're trying to deny their own characteristics. So I'm still collecting stories. People can submit their stories. I'm sure I'll get another inundation, but I'd like to air as many and as the most powerful ones possible to give these women a voice.
mhm,
So a large portion of the book will be personal stories, and to see the common pattern across cases. It's almost like a playbook.
mhm,
It is a playbook
mhm,
that family courts have tried and tested and now
mhm,
feel that they can implement with impunity. Um, and so that will compose one third of the book.
mhm,
The other third will be how the players in the courts are have the exact same perpetrator psychology as either the violent perpetrator, the violent family member themselves, or the violent prisoners that I have treated.
mhm,
They have the exact same psychology and operate in the exact same modalities. So, in other words, my work with street gangs, violent street gangs, is actually helping me to interpret the family courts. And then the last third will be the societal structure that has allowed for this to happen. How can this be so endemic so as to affect all states in the entire country? One case of child abuse, we would be up in arms about uh, keeping the perpetrator away, placing temporary restraining orders that become permanent restraining orders, or imprisoning them uh, for harming their children or other family members. And yet we have an entire judicial system that is deliberately, knowingly trafficking children to their violent torturers and murderers.
mhm,
And how is this allowed to happen? And what has allowed what was set up
Mhm.
as protecting the families. The family court system was set up to protect families, and
Mhm.
yet they have become family destroyers, annihilators. How has this come about? I'll address this from a societal standpoint and a public health standpoint.
Well, I would like to have you back on so we can even continue this discussion further into the CPS realm. Um, how can people reach you if they have any questions?
Yes, I do encourage submissions for the book. Any comments are welcome. I can be reached through the website bandylee.com. That's B as in boy, ANDYLEE.com.
I thank you for your time and your expertise. So, don't jump off. Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in these family courtrooms. I am your host, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again here with Dr. Bandy Lee and other exciting guests. Thank you very much, Dr. Bandy Lee.
Thank you for having me.